Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. Sharon Wine, I'm the Director of Communications here. I organize the series. This is as loud as I'm going to talk today. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I want to do our usual housekeeping. I want to thank today's head chef and our crew for this very large and delicious meal. That helps so much. We compost leftovers and plates. And anything else, put it in the garbage, put your silverware in our soapy bags. That just helps the crew get through cleanup. Is there any community announcements today? No?
Well, I will remind everyone that the Dean's quarterly seminar for the craft of teaching is this Friday. The particulars escape me. But if you go to the craft of teaching on our website, so this is when an alum returns, and I just can't get really like contact who the person is. But go to the craft of teaching. It may be too late to just sign up for lunch, but you can certainly participate in this session. So that'll be this Friday at noon.
Anyone else? Community announcements? No? Okay. Well, I just want to remind you we still have 3 weeks after today, 3 more lunches. So next week, we're going to have Dr. James Woodruff. He's the Associate Dean of Pritzker, and he's very involved with the new trauma center that's being built between UC and Sinai. So he's going to be talking about that initiative and what it's really going to be about. So I encourage you to come to that. The week after that is our quarterly Dean's Forum. We have Jeff Stafford on his book. And the week after that, we're having a special Friendsgiving. No speaker, but we're going to bring some board games. Some low-key board games, so it's going to be cool. Like anagrams and fun things like that. So please sign up for any or all of those. So as for today, I'm really pleased to be able to announce our guest today. He's an alum of the school. He's an MDiv alum, 96. 96. Our guest for today is Reverend Al Sharp. He is the founder and executive director of Clergy for a New Drug Policy, or CNDP, which mobilizes clergy nationally to end the war on drugs, as we know it, and it calls for help, not punishment, response to drug policy. Reverend Sharp has been working on progressive causes for many years. He was the founding executive director of Protestants for Common Good, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and then he was executive director for the Community Renewal Society, so he brings years of experience to this super important topic. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Sharp.
Well, Karen, thank you. Let me know if the sound is right. And let me also say that while I'm going to talk for a few minutes, please feel free to interrupt with questions as they occur to you. There'll be plenty of time after I finish also to ask questions, but don't feel this is a lecture that should be uninterruptible. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years since indeed I was a student here. I will also say that I had our wedding reception in this wonderful room in 2002, and it's a privilege to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity. I am going to ask that we distribute, Karen, this document, which is called, if you need more, I've got more, which is called Religious Declaration on Drug Policy. It is a document that sets forth on, just in a few words, what we are about, why we do it, and it gives you an opportunity to sign. I hope you will, and during the course of my remarks you'll understand why I hope you will and what your signature might mean. And always want to make simple questions complicated. I have this box which, if you do sign it, you can place it in as you leave, and the complicated question is, where do I put this so you're most likely to do it? And I will let you...
I'll put it over.
Okay. I doubt that you're going out this way. And
if you didn't get a survey...
yes.
Not everybody else.
I didn't get a survey.
No. Or enough for everybody. Sorry.
do is talk a little bit about who we are, Clergy for a New Drug Policy, what we do, and of special importance here is theological perspectives on what we do. I mean, we are in a place of certainly theological inquiry, presumably of deep faith, and one of the reasons this work is so exciting to me is because it does speak, as indeed the period of time that Karen has mentioned has, to what I care about most. And so I am constantly trying to think about our particular project here and how one can think about that theologically. And I hope I will feed your own thoughts on that. And again, welcome your comments. It's one reason I'm so glad to be here. I will say Clergy for New Drug Policy is a work in progress. We launched our website just last March. One of your former colleagues is my new project coordinator, Catherine Ray. She just started about 2 weeks ago, and if you go to our website, and the URL is on the sheet that we've handed out, you will see the first blogs that she has posted. That's one of her responsibilities. Now, I want to start in this way. Partly this helps me because I need to understand where you are on this topic. How many of you know The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander? Not everybody. I like to think, pardon?
They must read it.
Then you have to read it. I think it was published, I think, in 2008, so it's been around for a while now. I consider it the contemporary Uncle Tom's Cabin. It says more about race and has incited or engaged more people in acting positively to change racial relations in this country than probably any other book that I can think of, certainly in recent years. So I'm going to ask you to see this and read it if you haven't. For those of you who have, I've brought two more, that's it. This book preceded Michelle Alexander's book by probably 10 or 15 years. It was written by T. Richard Snyder, and I guess I like to show people this book because I love the title, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Punishment. And it does very much what she does. I mean, he's not a lawyer, but he makes all the arguments about the prison pipeline, just from neighborhoods right into prisons with maybe a brief acquaintance with school until things don't work out for you. He makes so many of the arguments that she does, and I commend this book to you as a sequel to hers or before hers. And the third, I also love this because of the title, and it speaks in a secular way to what we do, and was written by the chairman of public policy at the college at one point, Jim Leitzel, who's actually given a TED Talk on this book. It's called Regulating Vice. Regulating Vice. What a terrific title. And the basic argument, it's mostly about drug use, but his, in this case, secular reasoning provides a conceptual framework for how we think about our work, and because it applies more broadly, I think that makes it even more interesting and something to perhaps be challenged. What he does is speak about drug use and then other vices you might think of, whether you call them vices or not, gambling, pornography, prostitution, and he says you should view those with the same basic paradigm, which is to repress them and to, through acts of violence, which I consider arrest and certainly incarceration to be, to respond to vices in that way creates so much more damage than it does both socially and to the individuals upon whom such violence is imposed. And he analyzes each in a very rigorous way. So I recommend those three books. I'm also, just because it's interesting to me, it may not fit into the flow of this talk, and I worry much more, as you'll see in the religious declaration, about many more things than just the drug laws, but I'm just interested. How many of you, as did not happen in Ohio yesterday for reasons that actually may be understandable, how many of you would support legalization of cannabis? Yeah. Well, you're in line with the mainstream, maybe a little in advance of it. It's certainly well over 50%, probably in the low 60% nationwide. Harder question. How many of you would support the decriminalization, which means it's a civil sanction like a traffic ticket, not part of your criminal justice record, the decriminalization of all drugs? Wow, good for you. Okay, we'll come back to that. And I'd like to make the case. I'm very heartened by your response. Now, for those few of you who haven't read the new Jim Crow, which basically makes the argument that this is the third imposition of a caste system on African Americans, the first being slavery, the second being Jim Crow, the third being the war on drugs, which has created a caste structure that is so profoundly disturbing. That's her basic argument. The basic numbers, pardon me for those of you who haven't heard them, for 1 of every 15 whites, African Americans, there are 104 African whites in prison. 1 out of every 34 Hispanics are in prison. 1 out of every 15 African Americans is in prison right now in this country, as of the time that Michelle Alexander wrote her book. More broadly, 1 out of every 100 people in this country has some involvement with the criminal justice system. And again, so much of this is attributable to the war on drugs, which ramped up in 1980. 1 out of every 34 individuals in this country has involvement with the criminal justice system if you add probation and parole. And one more number that is absolutely chilling. 1 of every 9 African American young men between the ages of 20 and 35 is in prison today. Not in prison today. Will be jailed during that period of time in their life. Another generalization that is stunning is that there are more African Americans in prison right now that are attending our state universities in Illinois. So there are a lot of facts and figures that you can roll out, and Michelle Alexander's book is an extraordinary source of them. Let me just tell you one little comment, because I think it's so much more graphic than facts and figures and numbers. I'm a great admirer of Toni Preckler, who is the Cook County Board president. She is working very hard to reduce the population of Cook County Jail, which when she took office had about 10,000 individuals in it. It's now down to about 8,000. It's a travesty that people go in and are basically held there for an average of up to 25 days before their cases even move towards a hearing, let alone trial. And there are many other aspects of the jail that are very, very troubling. A commission came in to look at the operations of Cook County Jail. And she was responsible for the tour, and they all looked around and they spent their time. And then as they were leaving, and there was kind of an exit interview, one of the people on the commission who'd come from out of state to look at the jail said, "Where is your jail for white people?" Well, if you've ever been to Cook County Jail, you understand exactly what is being talked about. If you've ever sat in the waiting room, look around. You don't see many white folks there. So that, by way of background, is what Clergy for a New Drug Policy is trying to respond to. What do we do? It ain't a large corporation. It's me, a project coordinator, now Catherine Ray. I invest quite a bit in social media, and indeed, if I can say so, we're very effective, and we probably couldn't have been to the same degree because of what social media enables us now to do. If you're on Facebook, take a look. You're going to see a lot of our stuff popping into your likes. In less than 6 months, we're liked by 2,300 people, which I'm told isn't that bad. I'm still learning about Twitter. We're retweeted pretty widely, so if nothing else, we're reaching people out. So we are a website, which we launched in March. I personally organize in the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states because part of my funding comes in a very small way from a group called the Marijuana Policy Project. And those are states that they tell me and they want me to help affect the possibility that we will achieve taxing and regulating marijuana in the next couple of years. So I've spent a lot of time in Maine, in Rhode Island, in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maryland. I just came back from a week in Pennsylvania where we're trying to pass, if you can believe it, medical marijuana, which should have happened a long time ago. I played a role personally in helping to pass medical marijuana in Illinois, and I could talk to you for about an hour on the importance and the compassionate role of medical marijuana. And I know a fair amount about the science of it. So we organize in person. We invest in social media. We have a website, and that's basically how we move forward. Now, let me say something about the context. And if you wonder about progress, and I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not making deep philosophical statements about whether progress is possible or whether it's real, but I will tell you this. With Protestants for the Common Good, we went down to Springfield. In our early years, we're talking about 1996, 97, 98, one of the things we worked on was dealing with the reality that paying your debt to society is an absolute myth. People don't have a second chance when they come out of prison. And that was an obvious thing for people that care about the common good to work on. And so we worked on it, we worked mostly on re-entry. How do you make it possible for people to re-enter society? Sealing their records, expunging their records, changing licensing laws which prohibit them even working in certain fields with limitations that are absolutely ridiculous. The more we looked at the need for re-entry, the more we saw that there were so many people that shouldn't be in prison in the first place. And that's what led to the concern about the drug war. So I don't know how to say this graphically, except to say when my colleague and I would walk into a legislator's office in 1997, 98, and we want to talk to you about re-entry, we want to talk to you about people who are in prison, they couldn't get us out of there fast enough. It was like somebody had dropped, a stink bomb on the floor, and these fumes were just ushering forward. A funny look on their face, nice to talk to you out of there. Well, fast forward, 18, 20 years, the governor has a commission now on criminal justice and sentencing reform. You read about mass incarceration every day. Bless his remarkable heart, our president has now made this a signature issue in the last year of his campaign. But just thinking where we were then and where we are now says, have heart. Social change doesn't always happen fast, but it can happen, and this is an example of it. Now, I won't belabor you with more statistics on how the war on drugs has contributed to mass incarceration. You can read Michelle Alexander's book. I will say that between 1985 and 2000, expenditures increased by a factor of 10 to fight the war on drugs. The Drug Enforcement Administration had a budget of about $80 million in the early 1980s. It's over $1 billion now. FBI increased by about tenfold. Department of Defense on these kinds of things by tenfold. There were 500,000 people in prison, 50,000 people in prison in the late 80s. It's now well over 500,000. So the numbers are all there. To me, this issue speaks to our deepest faith in a number of ways. Let me tell you how I've tried to think about it. And there's a little bit in the religious declaration, which again, I hope you will sign. And again, the reason for the signature on it is this, and I'll make a little bit of a digression. Part of our organizing strategy is to get at least 1,000 signatures on the religious declaration and use those to take action on our agenda items, which are listed here. Let me list those agenda items. Obviously the drug laws, medical marijuana, decriminalization, legalization of marijuana, but also harm reduction. The notion that if you make a phone call because you find someone who's near death due to a heroin overdose, you're not going to be arrested, that's harm reduction. The idea of clean needles so that someone isn't using an infected needle when they're an addict. That's very controversial for a lot of people. That's harm reduction. Police forfeiture. Digression because I'm going through our agenda. Right now, under what's called with a bland title, civil asset forfeiture, police can seize property if they think that property is in any way involved in a drug crime. Becomes their property. The person whose property is seized, often very poor people, have to go to court to get their property back. Two conflicts of interest. One is that money is used to enhance police budgets. And then the second thing is simply the fact that you have to go to court to prove your innocence rather than the other way around. There's one more agenda item that I'm going to hold for just a minute because it really speaks to our vision for what we want to accomplish. So going back to how one articulates our faith in relation to this work, I tried to think systematically about Christian perspectives on the law and how we think about law that in any way would justify arresting people, sometimes, very often incarcerating them, for using drugs in a non-violent way. What possible explanation does our faith give us that allows us to use the law this way? Well, the three main uses for the law I came up with are deterrence, and I want to talk about that. But certainly, what are you deterring people from if they're not harming others? The second is rehabilitation. And rehabilitation left the minds of our law enforcement and prison system a long time ago. It isn't happening. And the third is retribution. You know, if somebody's done something wrong, somehow they ought to pay. But think about it hard. Jesus didn't say, if we're doing this from a Christian perspective, Jesus didn't say a lot about retribution. As I say in our website, he didn't say to the woman caught in adultery, you know, get out of the jailhouse and then maybe we can talk. He said, go and sin no more. You know, I'm as concerned about proof texting as any of you, even the great scholars here. But you got to find a theme somewhere when you look at the prodigal son, you look at how we talk with the woman at the well, you look at all that he said, Jesus said about mercy and forgiveness, all that he did to heal. He engaged, he persuaded, he taught, he captured people's hearts. He didn't try to make them better through force. And arresting people and putting them in jail is an act of force. So I've tried to think about it that way. I would be very grateful if some of you would go to our website where I have faith perspectives on the war on drugs. I've written the Protestant one. We have 2 statements from the Jewish community there. And I want to read to you, because I'm proud of it, frankly, the one that was just posted yesterday by a Muslim. And she makes this same point. Her name is Rabia Terry Harris. And she says, we seek, and as you probably know, Muslims abstain from all drugs, alcohol, but all non-prescription drugs. So you'd wonder, well, why aren't they against the war on drugs? And she explains why in this piece. We seek to develop, and she's saying this is what we do, not what we should do. We seek to develop character by force. Practical experience shows that this is a losing battle. It is not that people do not care for morality, it is that the application of force produces negative results when the development of character is at issue. Her blog is on the website. I responded to it with my own blog called Law and Character. I'd welcome your reactions on it. Terry, just to do a reality check. Do I have about 5 or 10 more minutes? Yeah. Am I going too long? With that as background, what is our vision? I mentioned decriminalization. Now, if more than 2 hands go up, I'm going to be both thrilled and surprised. Does anybody know what Portugal does when it comes to drug policy? Anyone know? What Portugal does? What Portugal as a nation does, what their drug policy? Well, I'm not doing my job, and an awful lot of other people aren't doing their job. If more of you, at least some of you, can answer that question. I've been to Portugal and I've seen it. It's startling, and it's a vision for this country. No, as Hillary said about income inequality, we're not Denmark. I know we're not Portugal, but think about the model and think of what it would take to apply here. Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. They did it for interesting circumstantial reasons. They had an inflow of use. It was visible all over Lisbon because of changes in that country and leadership. That was a huge problem. But instead of repression, the president of Portugal brought together a large commission, including some real scholars, and they came up with this approach. It's very simple. They have what are called dissuasion commissions, a doctor, a lawyer, social worker. Police are now trained, and as far as I can tell, very happy to do it, to refer anyone they pick up to one of those commissions. Now, it has to be said, trafficking is illegal. We're talking about use. And use, if an officer comes across somebody who's defined as probably an amount less than what a normal user would use over 10 days. So, you know, a predictable amount for use. Police refer the individual to the dissuasion commission. The commission's job is to interview that person and determine whether there's an addict problem here, whether somebody is really messed up because of drugs, or whether basically it's recreation. 90% of the cases, which would be arrests in this country, maybe not jail, people don't go to jail for marijuana for the most part, but 90% of the cases are referred to community service, maybe a fine like a traffic ticket here, or no problem at all. That means their courts are cleared, their police time is cleared, but 90% of the cases we would be working with here. The remaining 10%, and here's the core, can be referred to treatment. It's not mandatory. But the commission says, we've got a bed for you, or we have an inpatient, or, residential, not a residential, but counseling opportunity, or whatever the kind of treatment is, and that's also what works. It's a terribly complex question. And that's what they do. Here's the thing. Drug use has gone up only to a minor degree, if at all. I mean, negligible across the population. It's gone down for teenagers, and crime has not increased. And to the extent it's even gone up, it's gone up less than in the adjoining Iberian countries. So the fact that the sky would fall is simply not proven to be true. So that's my own vision, and I want to get the word out as broadly as I can. But here's what's happening, and I'll close with this. It's beginning to happen in this country. Now, one of the things that has to be said is people of faith have really just not come out in response to the war on drugs. We're silent, which I think is morally wrong. Why is that? Because frankly, in our mostly white suburban areas, they don't get hit by the war on drugs. There's a whole different arrest pattern. If a kid gets in trouble, someone goes to the principal, somebody finds treatment, you avoid any legal consequences. As you know, that certainly isn't true in the impoverished neighborhoods that all of us know so much about, especially in Chicago. We haven't said anything about the war on drugs until the heroin crisis, death by overdose. What is happening now, and I'm not dating this falsely, last March, the police chief in Gloucester, Massachusetts, after having had 4 heroin deaths by overdose in a couple of months, said, I can't stand this anymore. I'm making an announcement. I'm putting out the word that if you all bring your stuff here, we will not arrest you. We will try to find you treatment. And he's become a national figure. What is happening now in the Chicago suburban area, not the city of Chicago, the police chief of Mundelein fairly recently did the same thing. I went to hear him speak because I wanted to recruit him for our website, which I have. And I said, Chief, why only heroin? He said, no, we're doing this for all drugs. So in some very powerful and important way, Portugal is coming to this country. And our mission, my mission, bringing this forward to people of faith, bringing it forward to a broader audience, is to try to bring that vision to this country. So what can you do? You can sign the religious declaration. There's something very, and I will put your name on our website with your permission. There's something very specific, pretty small, but pretty big to me. I can't find many people to reach out to, especially clergy in Vermont and in Maryland. If any of you have colleagues and friends in Vermont and Maryland, call me, send me an email. I really need the help. Doing what I do is like doing a political campaign. You start with the people you know and you reach out. So I need your help, especially in Vermont and to a lesser degree in Maryland. The other thing you can do is take this issue to your churches. Some of you are, maybe all of you are going to be ministers someday. And when I think, some of you, a lot of our class did. It was amazing. With the ethos here, you start out saying, well, I'm going to be a pastor, and then you look around and you look at what's valued at the highest level, and you think of doctoral programs. Some very good people who would have been great ministers, maybe professors, maybe not. In any event, for those of you who are going into churches, if you do care about social justice and how to bring that forward into your congregational setting, and I know a lot about this, I did it for 15, 18 years, it's a complicated question. But I will say this, if there's any issue that lends itself to that kind of involvement, it is, criminal justice reform. You can visit people in prison, you can write letters. There's all sorts of things that are happening around you legislatively, at the county, state, the federal level, where you can lobby in all sorts of ways. So there's just no excuse to not have this be part of a church's social advocacy agenda. The only excuse I can think of is it's crowded out by 3 or 4 better issues, and I think those are hard to find. So take this issue to your churches. It seems to me that Luke 4:18, 19 isn't what Jesus said by accident. He said, I'm anointed to bring good news to the poor, and sent to proclaim release of the captives, recover his sight to the blind, let the oppressed go free. And that first appearance in the synagogue, he refers about the release of the captives. So nothing is done more to create more captives than the war on drugs, and there's no issue we can take on that won't help more people fairly soon. So that's the word going out. I'd welcome your questions. I'd welcome your involvement. I should say one thing about the religious declaration. The hardest issue for people of faith to accept will be not medical marijuana, not decriminalization. It will be tax and regulate. I believe in that. I can tell you why I do. But I didn't want to lose a whole bunch of people not signing the religious declaration. So where it comes to that part of it, where you're making a commitment, I say decriminalization or tax and regulate. So you're not setting yourself up for something you may not be willing to support, although by the show of hands you are willing to support. But it's a tough sell. I can tell you how I sell it, but keep that in mind when you read the religious declaration. Now any questions? Yeah.
Secular equivalent for those of us not religious?
I don't have one as part of our work. What I would do is refer you to people. The major group on this is the Drug Policy Alliance. They're terrific. I know most of these groups pretty well now. Marijuana Policy Project, the Drug Policy Alliance goes the full Monte, if you will. Everything having to do with drug policy, not just marijuana. Yes?
I wrote my question down, so I'd like to read it out. Well, I had a question regarding legislation and legislators. I know that ideally this would be a bipartisan issue.
Sure.
Obviously, in our current political climate, it sort of isn't. But also I have a question, is it? And have you engaged with policymakers? And if so, have you been able to accomplish a bipartisan effort? Or have you been really focusing on liberal, progressive, aka Democrats?
No, we reach out to everybody, and the only circle we draw around ourselves is that we're reaching out to people of faith. But I would give you some, I think, good news. This is a much more of a bipartisan issue than you might expect. The single biggest thing that's happening at the federal level, where we're going to encourage take action, and we enable you to take action on our website, is what's called the Smarter Sentencing Act, and that has a very broad, bipartisan base. There's something that is co-sponsored by Rand Paul, way out in the right, certainly as a libertarian anyway, and Cory Booker, who's not exactly, he's from the other side of the spectrum, but that deals with what is called in a complicated term collateral consequences. Right now, if you even have a marijuana arrest, certainly if you have a conviction, and not to mention the harsher drugs, you can't get food stamps if you're convicted. You can't get a Pell Grant as a student. You can't, you have a heck of a trouble getting a job. You can't get public housing. Landlords can discriminate against you. And this is because, in many cases, of a marijuana arrest, in some cases because of conviction. And Cory Booker and Rand Paul are together sponsoring a bill to change that. So, and my gosh, Pat Robertson has come out legalizing marijuana. I think Mike Huckabee just did. So there's a very unholy alliance coming together on this stuff. So we haven't created it, but we're certainly glad to see it. Yes?
I have a question, because I'm not affiliated with a congregation or any sort of religious thing. So for you, what is important about having the religious component, in particular congregations, committed to this issue?
Well, first of all, I think it's funny, I'm a policy wonk, and I often spend so much time thinking about these things in policy terms, so I thank you for the question. First of all, it's important for the church people of faith to think about this, because I think it should be seen as an expression of their faith. Simple reason, which it took me a long time to say, because I don't like proof texting. I'm very careful about what I say is a moral and not a moral issue. I think tough on crime, acts of violence upon people who haven't hurt others is immoral. This is straight act. I've always tested myself on what I could preach on from the pulpit as a moral issue. Say, if you want to be a Christian, you can't do this. And again, we are interfaith, but I approach it from the Christian perspective. That's true to me about sexuality. It's true to me about genocide. It's true for me about, very few, but obviously very profound issues. Race, of course. To me, this is a moral issue. I could preach on this from the pulpit and say, as a Christian, you can't permit this to happen. So that's one answer. Then the other answer is tactical. You build your base, and people of faith can and should be an important political base. So but it was that middle part. The fact that, we have to do this as a matter of fundamental morality that is my most basic answer. Then tactical, and then just being true to ourselves as people of faith. Yes?
More than a question, I have some comments.
Sure.
Perhaps some recent discussion.
I want to make sure, can everybody hear?
Yeah, sorry. My thing is that I think that one of the issues here that makes this so important, this kind of campaigns, also is when you said that people that when they leave the jails, they don't have a second chance.
Yeah.
Also, people that don't have a second opportunity are the missing and dead people that the drug war has played so far.
Yeah, yes.
And I think one of the worst things that has happened in recent times for the USA, Mexico, and Central America is the Merida Initiative. This initiative, the Merida Initiative.
Oh, yes. I don't know much about that. I've heard the name, but I haven't been involved.
Which is this initiative created, I think, in 2008 to make like a corporation to fight drug trafficking, drug wars. So USA gives billions of dollars to Mexico, to Central America to keep fighting this.
Yeah.
But I think it has created one of the biggest paradoxes in recent history and also hypocrisy. Because on one side, one of the biggest crops nowadays in Mexico is the amapola flower, which eventually becomes heroin.
Yeah.
And on one side, with all these drugs crossing from south to north, and from north to south, all the weapons crossing. And then we have this gigantic problem with so many people missing, so many people dead, and we still keeping the stance that yes, we have to make a war. When one of the things you said, I think is that drugs are part of the everyday life of people. We have to acknowledge that. Even sometimes if someone gets offended or doesn't want to accept that, it's a thing. People get high every day. That happens in this country, in Mexico, Central America, in all the world. That happens.
Which is the key argument here. You're not going to stamp this out. So the question, what do you do about it that is as humane a response to the issue or to the question as possible?
And I think that one of the problems here is that it's such a big problem because so many politicians are involved, so many big interests, like on the dark, on the shadows that we don't see. And I really acknowledge this kind of initiatives because I think that this big problem needs a lot of solutions. A religious way, a legal stance, I think also an educational stance. We need to change this, and I always make this question that it might be naive, but why we spend so much in weapons and bullets, and why don't we start spending more money in schools?
All great comments, and actually your comments are very helpful because I haven't gotten to the point of thinking about the international dimensions here, but I should. I mean, it's a major part of the picture. One thing I didn't know, and still don't know very much about, is we're bound by international treaties to what we can do ourselves and what we can ask other nations to do. I'll try to learn more about that. It's a fundamental point. Yes?
So I want to follow up on my colleague's question over here. Do you think that you could make the argument that you're making from a secular morality perspective? And if so, what would you lose if you did?
I'd lose, I probably wouldn't reach some of the audience I am trying to reach. We all pick our niches. I would say it's a profound question. I mean, you can appeal in the name of our faith and the teachings of our faith. Or you can use different words that may say some of the same things, and be saying the same things. For example, there's a wonderful book, I'm going to give you a fourth book that I would suggest. It's by George Lakoff called Moral Politics. I commend this book to you. There were kind of one book that were to inform you on, political, quote, value perspectives, and it'd be that book. Because he tries to explain a very interesting question. How do you explain, and I will get to your point, how do you explain why people on the right take the positions they do on particular issues, and people on the left take the positions that they do on particular seemingly unrelated issues? Why are people on the right, we'll say pro-life, shutting down the environment, against big government, against taxation, against gun control? What explains the circle, what the things that are within that circle on both the right and the left? And he answers that question, and as a recovering Calvinist, I relate to this, maybe why I'm doing the work that I do. He says the only model he can find that relates it is a strict father, strict parent model for a family. Think about it. And then a nurturing parent, a nurturing family model. When you begin to think about those two spheres, if you will, you can translate that into what would be the position of folks on the left and on the right. And it makes a great deal of sense. It's a very good book, and he's a highly respected linguist. Now, in that book, he talks about what constitutes a moral position. And he says it's basically, you decide something's moral or not. Experientially, do people flourish given certain things that are done or not done? That's what you look at. Does whatever you're making a moral judgment about affect their flourishing, their health? Wealth is not necessarily a bad thing. Their ability to be whole and complete people. That's your criteria for morality. What enables people to flourish? Now, Chris gets a flourish is a fancy word. It came, Protestants for the Common Good, from Franklin Gamble. And he writes about the common good in theological terms, and the parable of the Good Samaritan is really about helping people to flourish. Well, that can be a secular word as well. So I think it's the dimension you bring to your assertion about what's moral and not as opposed to whether it's faith or simply secular in your mind. If your criterion is experiential, you can say, that's what Jesus taught about X, Y, and Z. Or you can say, I'm defending this on secular ground. So it's a profound question. I'm not sure it's hard to understand the answer. I don't think it is. Does that speak to what you're asking?
Sure.
Okay. Yes?
Hi, thanks so much for being here. How have you otherwise engaged other faith traditions? You mentioned a Muslim woman who has a blog on it, but in what ways are you engaging other religious traditions? And are there ways for maybe some of our students who are identified with a particular tradition that they're eager to get involved with?
Well, first is anybody can sign a religious declaration, and that sounds, organization is self-serving, except if we have 1,000 names on that, and we really make those names known at the right time and the right way, it matters. Secondly, we have on our website something called Faith Perspectives, and I mentioned where one thing I haven't gotten yet, actually, I don't know why, is Catholic. That's kind of interesting. Haven't gone there yet. A lot of Catholics around. The third thing is I speak to all groups, and what do we do ultimately? Let's put it this way. I spent last week in Pennsylvania. Started in Pittsburgh with the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary Presbyterian, press conference in Harrisburg on medical marijuana. Went to Philadelphia and spoke to clergy there. At our press conference was George Stern, who's head of the Social Interaction Network, himself a rabbi in Philadelphia. If I could find Muslims to stand up with us, believe me, I would love that. This takes a little bit of setup, but it does speak to your question. We're going to have an event in Rhode Island, Providence, on December 5th. It's an amazing event. The title is Ending the War on Drugs, Healing Communities, Cops, Clergy, Docs, Speak with One Voice. There are going to be 3 panels, and all these professions are stepping up now. There's a new group that has just started called Physicians to Regulate Cannabis. Docs. There's been a group for years now, has 150,000 members, called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Police that, were SWAT teams going into people's houses, mess people up, arrest people, looked around and said, what am I accomplishing here? law enforcement, and then Clergy for a New Drug Policy. And I'm bringing those groups together to speak with one voice. To speak to your question, what I'm looking for on our panel is a Muslim, a Jew, a Catholic, and a Protestant. Yes.
Well, first I'd like to congratulate you on the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
That's really nice. And I'm a little concerned. I'm concerned about the big picture here. There were some remarks earlier that are relevant. But when I think about drug policy, I also tend to think about another big problem in the United States, and that's what gun control.
Yes.
And the analogies. If we look at gun control, we find there's the organization that responds negatively to it. And we also find there's huge corporations, weapons manufacturers, weapons distributors. It really is an international problem there. And I'm wondering what the bigger structures that we have to face up to deal with in the drug issue.
You know, it's a good question. Whenever someone says it's a good question, it's because someone doesn't know the answer. But I hadn't thought in those terms quite exactly. I mean, you do get angry at the pharmaceutical companies. When I was campaigning for medical marijuana, you talk about religious values. One of the religious values that you had to bring forward, it's a negative one, in campaigning for medical marijuana, was hypocrisy. Because you had legislators saying, my gosh, you know, it isn't a drug, it hasn't been approved by the FDA, you can't use it as medicine. Oxycontin, Vicodin, have been approved by the FDA, they're illegal, they are badly misused. Now, why has that happened? It's got to be in part because of the power of the drug companies. So that's one behemoth corporate structure that you want to take on. I'd have to think about the others. I'd welcome your thoughts. I haven't quite thought in those terms. The thing you talk about is not corporate. It's the gosh darn tough on crime. The mentality. We were talking about this the other day in a panel downtown. Why do you get these horrible sentencing laws, which are terrible? I could list some of them. It's because something terribly bad happens, and a legislator says, man, I'm going to get myself reelected for the next 5 terms. I'm going to go for a sentence increase on this. You know, it appeals to public sympathy, but has nothing to do with the underlying structures and problems. So that doesn't answer your question, but that's the biggest enemy I see when you're trying to push some of this back. Everybody's so afraid as an elected official to be tough on crime. Other corporate interests, I'll think about that. Yes?
Following up on that question, the question that I have has to do with who's benefiting from the war on drugs. And there are, again, like the gun issue, there are interests that benefit from it.
Yeah.
And they're very, very powerful and very strong and speak to some of these other questions. So that that dimension, which is international, can't be left out.
No, it can't. I say I feel I'm glad to be directed to that because I haven't thought about it a lot. I don't know a lot about the international dimensions. One has to look at that. This isn't, I think, the thrust of your question, but let's start on the street. It's the gangs. They're benefiting. And I had a really interesting experience. I went up, I was looking for someone to tell a story in a presentation that I was making. I can give you all the facts and figures in the world. One person getting up and saying, here's what happened to me, you know, really is what matters. So I was up in a pretty tough neighborhood up in Roosevelt and Kensington, sitting in a McDonald's with a guy who'd been in prison for 30 years, but he's going straight now. And he said to me, I was saying something about legalizing drugs, and he said a couple of things. He looked around and said, 70% of the people you see in this McDonald's right now are hires on something. And they may be practicing selling drugs. They've got to feed their families. I mean, only the thing to be said here is you're going to have some drug war is a symptom, especially in the impoverished neighborhoods. And he said, if you legalize drugs, we'd have to get our money some other way just to feed our families. Not that there aren't terrible acts out there, but it's a whole source of income for whole communities that you simply have to find some other response to. As far as who else benefits in a kind of non-crime sense, although you might think it's criminal, in terms of corporate structures, international communities, The drug companies, I suppose, and international governments, but I'm going to beg off of that because I just don't know enough about it to answer your question well. Yes?
Your issue of being tough on crime, and it makes me think, because as parents of young children, it makes me think of, I think there's a culture of punishment when it comes to disciplining and raising children as well in this country, and I think that really feeds into and supports this logic of you have to, if someone does something wrong, they have to pay, right? When a child doesn't do what you tell them to do, you have to react in some way, it's less, we might not be as comfortable physically harming them, but we come up with different, sometimes, fairly, cruel, psychological ways of making them. And I think it comes down to power, right? They want to be in control.
Yeah, it's authority, it's insisting on obedience. I mean, Lakoff is brilliant on this, called moral politics. I tried to make the connection, and I say this in the blog that we put up yesterday with the Muslim piece, that at some level, we haven't gotten past Jonathan Edwards. In the 17th, 18th century, it was about sin, and punishment was to keep you on the right path so you had a chance for salvation. Well, I would bet nobody in this room believes in a literal heaven and hell. We don't talk a lot about salvation. Most of the Christians that I deal with, that's not big on their radar. But the phrase I use is, at some level, maybe so many of us are 21st century fundamentalists. It's in our psychological DNA, even though it's not what we profess as we describe what our faith means to us. I've spoken, at least from one Muslim perspective. If I could get back to your question about why our faith matters here, one Jewish writer, she's over at CTS, Rachel Mikva, wrote her blog, which we're going to put up shortly, about how she thinks about justice. She talks about 4 kinds of justice. Well, let's start from the notion that our faith calls us to justice. She talks about retributive justice. We talked about that. Someone did something wrong, someone got a date. And Jews have a different view on eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, perhaps, than we do. Interesting difference. Second is restorative justice. You hold someone accountable for their crime even as you bring forth the victim as part of that holding somebody accountable. And you do it as a community expression of justice on any particular crime. The third is procedural. Well, think about procedure in relation to the war on drugs. One of the most horrible procedures now in the administration of justice is our bail system. If you're poor and you're sitting there in bond court, you go before the judge and you can't pay, you go back to Cook County Jail, where you sit for 25 days, you lose your job, you may lose your family, and a whole bunch of other things happen. If you can pay bail, you don't go to jail. Procedural justice. And the last part is distributive justice. And if you don't think income inequality in this country has been increased because you have the impoverished neighborhoods where people are arrested and re-arrested for drug offenses, then you need to think, and you don't, but one needs to think a little bit harder. So restorative justice, retributive justice, procedural justice, and distributive justice. On all fronts, the war on drugs is a violation of all those categories of justice.
Perfect.
Okay?
We are out of time. Thank you all.